Mixing with Mike boot camp tip, creating definition in a mix with EQ. Now, of course, the purpose of equalization is to balance frequencies throughout the mix. We do this on individual instruments where we balance out the frequencies, and then their relationship to other elements of the mix, we want them to be balanced as well, so that ideally we achieve a mix that brings out the best or the best nature of all the individual elements of the mix. Now, it's kind of a lofty goal, and it's not really used a whole lot in modern mixing, which is one of the problems, unless you're dealing with more organic instrumentation and songs where the presentation is meant to be natural, and there's nothing wrong with that. In the modern pop environment, though, what you have are more extreme, exaggerated forms of compression, equalization, distortion, and effect processing that exaggerates things or hypes things up. So what I'm going to show you here is a technique that leans a bit in that direction, and this is only the first part of the process. So in an initial setup, what I've done is I've set up a mix which is just levels and panning, and then I went about the process of setting up a console. We went through a shootout. We ended up picking the API console. And with this, what I've done is I've only applied equalization. So on none of the instantiations here, is there any, in fact, some of them don't even have EQ, as you can see here. None of them have compression, so there's no compression. And effectively what I've done is I've boosted at one or two different frequency points. This is what I call a 2-point equalization technique or a 1-point equalization technique. The idea is that you boost dramatically into certain frequency zones that are important to the instrument, and then you bring the output level down. I could also bring the input gain down. That would be another way to do it, depending upon how I want to drive this into the compression, which I want to drive pretty hard, so I'm going to leave it as is. We'll get to that in another video. The idea of pushing into these frequencies in this way is that I can define each individual element of the mix into a tighter zone, and by pulling away the remaining frequencies by balancing the output gain, so I get somewhat of a balance of, the same level coming out of the output of the channel strip, I can achieve something that opens up the mix and defines instruments in a more distinct tonal area. So let's start by audio example here. And what I'm going to do here is just play a bit of this through a couple of sections without EQ, just so you get a sense of what the original is like. And then I'm going to bring in the EQ to show you what the difference is.
You're away and standing in place. You kick it with her, you know I'm for ya, but you can't deny me when you close your eyes. Been alone, this time is on ya. Seeing the sun fading away. Hope you know this ride can only go so far. The way you looking, I didn't notice till then. Who you fooling? 'Cause I don't believe your lies no more when you're talking. I just know you're clowning. Who you fooling? 'Cause I don't believe your lies no more. You're trying, you lost me, thinking that you could leave me, losing all the lies that you tell. The one who you're chasing, she ain't bad like me. Don't believe the lies that you tell.
Okay, so that's without EQ. Now this is with EQ. Here we go.
You know I'm away and standing in place. You kick it with her, you know I'm for ya, but you can't deny me when you close your eyes. Been alone, this time is on ya. Seeing the sun fading away. Hope you know this ride can only go so far. The way you looking, I didn't notice till then. Who you fooling? 'Cause I don't believe your lies no more when you're talking. I just know you're clowning. Who you fooling? 'Cause I don't believe your lies no more. You're trying, you lost me, thinking that you could leave me, losing all the lies that you tell. The one who you're chasing, she ain't bad like me. Don't
Okay, so you get the basic idea, right? Much more open, where the other mix, and I'll do a quick A B layer through the different sections. The other mix you'll notice, and this is what I really want you to listen for. If you're sitting in front of a pair of speakers, this you can hear this better than through headphones, but you can hear it in headphones as well. What you'll hear is that with the EQ out, the mix is kind of pulled in towards the center of the speaker. There's not a lot of height from it. There's not a lot of sound or extension of the low end, right? And there's a lot of mid range buildup, low mid range buildup. So, by applying this technique and focusing the individual elements of the mix into more distinct tonal layers, then what you get is the mix starts to stretch out because those interference patterns now become significantly less. Now, this is admittedly exaggerated, not just for the purposes of demonstration here, but also because in preparation for this, we'll be feeding into compression, which will help to glue a lot of the sound back together and bring back a little bit more of the warmth, body, and focus of the instrument, right? So, this is an important part of the process, and I just want to point it out. So, let me just do a quick A B, and then we'll go through some individual settings just so I can give you an idea of some of the things that I've done here. All right, so notice how the sound opens up, right, vertically and also depth wise, right? You'll feel a little separation of depth, some instruments sounding like they're behind each other. And I'll explain exactly why, but when each individual instrument finds a particular place in the vertical tonal zone, being like low frequencies below the speakers, high frequencies pushing things above the speakers. I'm pushing density into those particular frequency pockets, making the instrument more distinctly defined in that frequency zone. All right, so just notice that. I'm going to start without, and then I'll go in and out every couple bars.
You're away and standing in place. You kick it with her, you know I'm for ya. But you can't deny me when you close your eyes. Being alone, this time is on ya. Seeing the sun fading away. Hope you know this ride can only go so far. The way you looking, I didn't notice till then. Who you fooling? 'Cause I don't believe your lies no more when you're talking. I just know you're clowning. Who you fooling? 'Cause I don't believe your lies no more. You're trying, you lost me, thinking that you could leave me, losing all the lies that you tell. The one who you chase and cheat ain't back like me. Don't believe the lies that you tell. You make me feel left.
Okay, so what you heard there obviously is like a distinctly brighter, clearer version. Now, it's a little bit louder, but a lot of that is because the frequencies have pushed into more recognizable tonal zones. In other words, the individual instruments, you can really pick them out much more clearly. As I said, it's a bit exaggerated, and I'm going to show you why here in a second. Now, here's the kick drum EQ. So you could see what I've pushed into here. And part of this was a strategy where I wanted the bass to sort of sink down below the kick drum. So I pushed into, a 100 hertz here, and you could see just how dramatic that boost is. It's like a good, 10, 11 dB. Okay, I attenuated some low mids right there. I pushed into an attack frequency at 800 by about 10 dB. Okay, and overall, I've actually not pulled the level down as much as I normally do, probably because a lot of the energy in that mid range kind of leveled it out. Here, let me go over to another one. So that's a 2 point. You see 2 points that I boosted. Here's a similar thing with a clap track where I pushed into 1.5K and 700, kind of finding like a more distinct mid-range character. Part of this was because the claps were a bit bright, and I wanted the vocal to sit on top of the track. They were also a bit hollow sounding, so I wanted to push some energy. Same kind of idea here, and then I pull the fader back 5 or 6 dB to compensate for those boosts. So what ends up happening in the end is that the sound, and if you just want to see graphically, it'll look something like this, where if you were, say, to boost a particular point, right, and say you could do it with a narrow Q, it doesn't matter, Part of it does, but we'll explain, right? And so you have now an attack frequency. So let's just say that we boost into a couple of these points significantly. Now, this is going to look a little bit weird, but just to show you graphically what it looks like, I'm just going to put like a high shelf here. And so if I pull the output gain, the net effect will be something like this, where if I boosted by, 8 dB, right, something along those lines, and then I attenuated here, this is by just 3 dB, you could see that I've cut everywhere except for these couple boost points. And what that does is it opens up space for instruments that occupy those other lanes. Now, as I said, this is a bit extreme in terms of the actual, amount of gain. Part of working with the API that's great too is the more you push in, the sharper the Q gets, the narrower it gets. That's the proportional Q aspect of working with the API EQs. But the fundamental idea is that I can create separation between individual elements. Like, for example, let me just go through something here real quick, just with the drums in the chorus section. Right, so here I've defined different sounds into different lanes. There's claps, which I just showed you, so that has more mid-range frequencies of 0.7 or 700 hertz and 1.5 K. Then there are some snaps which I wanted to sit higher, so I put them at like a 5K boost. Right, this is a single point equalization technique, and that I don't need those snaps to have any body to them. I have all of that I need from the clap, and then there's also a stick part. This has 2 points of boost, but you notice that they're distinctly different than the ones for the clap, so they wrap around it. The other one was boosted at 700, this is at 500. The other one was boosted at 1.5, this is boosted at 3K. So they layer on top of each other, and when one disappears, you feel the subtle shift or difference between the two sounds. So as I go through all of the percussion, and like even just individual things like, little areas where there are fills, like there's a whole series of tracks that create fills, I can push in pretty hard, balance the output down, right, into different frequency zones. Here's a single point EQ technique at 3K. Here's another one that's also at 3K. They must be sounds that are similar or connected, or I clicked on the same one. Here are two that are boosted at other frequency points. The idea of the lower and the higher frequency is that one will act more as the note. If it's a musical instrument, it'll bring out the note if it's a guitar track. And obviously you can't push into an area where, some notes get extremely loud and others just disappear. Okay, so there's a part of this where you have to pay attention musically to what's going on. But, in this case, it's percussion. I can do this, balance the output, I can focus the individual sounds around that area, and then they actually kind of glue together. So for example, let me just go over to the chorus section here. I could pick a series of instruments here, just keyboard instruments, just so you can see. So what I have here is a marimba. I just cut those tracks, hold on. So I got these two to work together, right? And you can see just like an equalization pattern. I did it with the 560. So I'm shaping something that pushes a little bit more, in the body frequencies and into the upper mids or into the mid range. Here I'm pushing on this pluck part a little bit lower. So I'm pushing more down here instead of up in this area, right? And then kind of balancing out. Now, the two sounds together combined with some of these other elements though. So here I'm pushing into a lower tone, right? The 400 hertz alone, right? Balancing a little bit of the output. And what that does is it sets that tone kind of in the back a little bit darker, sets it a little bit more off in the distance. Then I have another part here. This one I actually ended up leaving alone. And then there's right? Then there's this little lead synth that I pushed in at 500. So that kind of has its own little layer. Again, the output pulled down so everywhere else is cut. So just notice this section with these keyboards and the way that they interrelate. Right? So I can make the interaction between them feel like they're coming from different heights, from different depth fields, just by working in this slightly extreme way. Now let me bypass it in and out just so you can get a sense for what it's like. Right? So that separation ends up being important. And there's many reasons for it, right? These same techniques work with vocals, with layers of guitars, with layers of percussion, and the way tracks work and interrelate together. So there's an important part of this. And once the compression helps to kind of focus things in, and then as you start to layer on compression and get to limiting stages, this is also part of a very important part of a way of creating competitive loudness, if that's what you're pushing towards. Because what will happen is when you have this somewhat extreme separation, the compression will glue that back together so it'll seem less stark, right? Less cold. You'll see that in an upcoming video. And the depth field now and separation of the elements is almost exaggerated, right? You can really pretty clearly hear all the different elements in the mix as you're going throughout. Now what happens is the more that you start to limit and compress later on, it's going to start to flatten out and lose a little bit of that depth. You'll get a little bit more equalness in the levels of the sounds as a result. But because everything is so starkly separated, when it starts to pull together, everything just feels more dense and more powerful instead of sounding muddy or choked. And that's an important part of the process here. So these 2-point and single point equalization techniques with extreme settings are a really powerful way of creating separation. It's a real secret that's been used over and over again in analog consoles. I worked so much this way, mixing EQing into compression, the thing you're not supposed to do, right? Supposed to put the compression first. But here, when you do it this way, now you can really, really, really gel together and get a lot of excitement and definition out of the individual sounds. And with that, create a real professional sounding mix. This is one step in the process. All right, so there's your boot camp tip, creating definition in a mix with EQ. If you're interested in more information like this in much more vivid detail, check out the boot camp at mixingwithmike.com. At the boot camp, here, it's a 52-week program. So when I talk about these equalization techniques, I go much farther into depth, and you'll see me use it on 4 different complete mixes throughout the whole program. And so you'll see it not just done on a rock mix, but done on an R&B mix, done on, EDM mix, right? And bringing in different styles of music as a way of demonstrating how these techniques can apply to all different, styles and genres. Check it out at mixingwithmike.com. It's the boot camp. And there's your boot camp tip for this week, creating definition in a mix with EQ.